I need to be outside getting some sun right now. Well, I can't because it's fucking raining, but I wish I could be.
Yeah, I'm the only one here who can. San Diego or LA has its benefits.
Dude, San Diego is fucking nice. I think if there's one place, isn't San Diego kind of more of like the less, how do I even put this? Like the less like crazy liberal part of California? Isn't that more like San Diego slash like that area?
Yeah, San Diego is the slower paced one. It has less of the pretension, but it also has a lot of douchebags and bros. And
Yeah.
if you wanted
Well,
to
there's a
find a
lot of fitness. There's a lot of fitness bros out there, right?
yeah, but bros
Yeah.
in particular, bro is the underlined word there. You'll find
Yeah.
want to start fights in bars and all kinds of
Oh
shit.
yeah. Yeah, like those kind of sort of the frat boy slash like small beach town vibe type of
Yeah,
dude.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're
Those are
not
the
as
fucking
they sound like one.
yeah. That's fucking funny.
Isn't WEC based out of San Diego?
Wick is based out of San Diego. That's where I met
Yeah.
Bailey at. Uh, yeah, I mean it's a cool gym. Definitely a cool gym. Very chaotic space, but
Fucking
definitely
whack.
yeah.
The guy. Dude, he's something else, man. I love it though. I love it and hate it at the same time.
I'm kind of with you there. It's something you can't communicate with, but you can appreciate whatever's going on. He's like
Exactly.
that's in
Yeah. I can follow the thought process, you know. It's,
yeah.
it's, it's not the way I do it, but I follow it.
That's why I want to meet him. The frenetic qualities, like after I'd hit my head, I was I think I was like charged up again, like a loose wire in water, and it reminded me a lot of injuries that I had when I was younger, or just like difficulty I had creating focus or creating like, sustained attention. And well, that's why I did all that neurofeedback and all that stuff when I was a kid, because
I was
there's
gonna ask you about that. Yeah.
tangible
How did
deficit.
that how did that work for you? Because I know there's a lot of people that when they do neurofeedback, and I've heard this from a lot of different people, that if you do it when you're young, when your brain is still very malleable, that it can really like almost change you in a good way. Like it can really set you up to be a better adult in like a way that's like extremely profound. Like there's not a lot of things that I think, because especially when you're at an age, you know, where your brain, you know, there's all these myths too about like, okay, well, you're like 26 or 27 years old now, and like your brain's fully developed, right? Like to some extent, I get that. I think it's more of like a kind of like a continuation more than it is like, okay, you're 25 and your brain's fully developed now. Because I think we both know a lot of people where you could definitely say that's probably not the case. But I think too, when you're younger, being able to take advantage of something like neurofeedback, where you're young and you're malleable and you can kind of like craft and direct your brain into the right direction. I think that's really interesting. I think you could really set a kid up for success, especially at a really young age, by having them do something like that super early on.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I don't know if I really. I don't know if I know I've took value from it. That's not something I'm concerned about, but I'm not
Right.
really sure where the value went, and it wasn't something that I was like tracking prematurely. Where I was like, "This is how I am. This is the thing that I like can corroborate is me." If someone were to ask what things are the telltale qualities of me,
Well, yeah, I'm sure it's hard to define as a kid too. You know, you just know yourself as a kid. You don't. It's different when, like for me, when I did it, I started doing it probably about 3 years ago, and I noticed an instant change in, you know, how I was like reacting to certain things. So I think it's different when you're already like aware, you're like old enough to be like aware of yourself, then you can start to see some of those changes. But yeah, I mean, yeah, you were probably using it, I guess, to like correct a deficit too. You said head trauma, right?
as a child, I'm not really sure if it was acknowledged that I had head trauma, but I was very like noticeably problematic in some ways. I was rambunctious and I would start fights or get into fights. not start fights necessarily, but I would definitely encourage the fighting.
Oh, dude, me too. Yeah,
Yeah,
I love that shit. That was my
yeah.
favorite shit, dude.
I,
And
I
then,
think
and
being a boy.
yeah, and I think too, like, dude, it took me a long time to kind of unlearn some of that. And I think there's some of it like I think when you're in high school, there's a lot of good components to your personality that end up taking sort of like these negative um manifestations because you don't like I remember when I was in high school, like I didn't have anything better to do other than just to like talk shit to people. Like and so that's like I feel like that's kind of like innate in my personality is like this is why I talk about it like the debunkers a lot, you know, because I know like there's some of that in me when I watch somebody online, like this whole debunking culture where people like that's all they do. They just get on Instagram and they're just making videos like shitting on other people. There's part of me that's like, oh fuck yeah, like I love doing that too, right? And I know where you're coming from with that. It's not this desire to actually provide good information to people. It's you just want to talk shit, right? And I know that person's doing that because I used to be that way, and so I can kind of see through some of that BS, like this facade that people put on where they're like, oh, I'm doing it for the greater good. It's to like, you know, fight misinformation and whatever. And I'm sure there could be some of that in there potentially. Not denying that, you know, people have like entirely horrible motives for why they're doing the things that they're doing. But I think there's definitely a component to it of like wanting to talk shit and liking to talk shit. And
Yeah,
I know because when I was in high school, I had no like constructive outlet for like anything that I was doing at the time. Like I had hobbies and I had things that I enjoyed doing and I liked fitness. I've been into fitness and nutrition for a long time, but I didn't like have a business and I wasn't like doing anything. I wasn't like training people or like dumping that energy into like actually like helping people or like, you know, starting a business or whatever. And so I think a lot of that energy that I had just kind of built up in me. And that's all I did is I just started shit with people, you know. I was never a bully. It was always people that like I felt deserved it, if that makes sense.
you know what I'm
But
saying?
yeah.
Yeah, that's why I said I never started the fights, but I would definitely encourage them.
Oh yeah. It was like it was like almost like I was waiting for that opportunity. I was like, please give me an opportunity so that I can jump in here and just either talk some shit or throw some fuel on the fire, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I think the thing that I took away from, and I think most people will take away from neurofeedback is observing their reactions minus the actual intonation of reactions. So seeing the
100%.
and the imbalances and just the when we say flow, right? You'll see like you go to a beach, you'll see the incoming like small waves that are brushing at the surface of the sand, or like the tides coming up onto shore, and you'll notice that they're not all the same shape. They're oftentimes like they just change, and sometimes one will rebuff another so that it's slow, and then it's all of a sudden way bigger. And that's kind of the nature of just anything ebbing and flowing, the nature of having there be a quality of um, variety. And when you're doing the neurofeedback, especially when I was like a young kid doing it with like the gamification of it, there was a ton of variety. And oftentimes the variety would play into, all right, I'm maintaining focus. Does my focus depreciate into frustration, or does it retain itself without me having to be super invested in the have all be all because I'm going to do this for another hour? And a lot of the things that play into that are essentially just not getting frustrated with your own thoughts and like staying ambient in the allowance of like, all right, this is where I'm at. I don't need to like be partial to what I'm thinking. But if I do want to pursue this, I can sort of direct it in some way or another.
Yeah, and I think that's the really interesting thing about neurofeedback. When you really think about it, it really is sort of the coolest thing because I mean, there's different kinds of neurofeedback. Obviously, there's forms where you do participate in it, and then there's forms where you don't, and it's more passive. But the end result is still pretty much the same, where it's providing the brain sort of this like mirror of itself, right? And that's it. It's just saying, hey, this is what you're doing, right? It's devoid of outcomes unless you're playing the game, but it's devoid of like inherent or implicit meaning. It's like you have this blank slate, and maybe you're playing a game and something doesn't go right in the game, and so you get this instant feedback that something in your inner environment is controlling this external thing, right? And I think it allows people, because it's hard to teach kids. You can't, it's difficult to teach a kid a theoretical concept about like, I guess, regulating their nervous system. It's easy for me to maybe talk to you about that, and for you to be able to process that in your own way and apply that to your life. But for a kid, they need that instant feedback, right? It's almost similar to what some people would call, like you said, either gamified training or like self-organization, where you're getting that instant feedback and the message is clear, right? I remember listening to Elon Musk talk about a lot of the stuff that he was trying to do with Neuralink, how like even when I'm talking to you guys right now, there's things that I want you to understand that I probably can never fully explain, because language, there's a barrier in language, right? There's a lag in the communication, either in my ability to express it or your ability to understand it. And I think with things like neurofeedback, or even like gamified training solutions, or I guess what you could just broadly refer to as like a self-organizing process, the feedback is instant. It's instantaneous.
Totally. I did the both. I did when I was like 7. I did the game one, sort of like Pac-Man, and I forget the other one. And then the one I did when I was 14 was the non-gamified one, and that one was a little bit of a shock, just how dull it was.
Yeah, because you're not really doing anything. I mean, it definitely still works, but that's because I have a system. It's called Near Optimal. Um, so I do it all the time. I do it like almost every day, or I did it every day for probably 5 or 6 months. And it's difficult to get people to understand exactly how something like that could work. Um, but it really is almost just this sort of basic reconditioning process. It's like the Pavlov's dogs, where uh, you ring a bell or something, the dog starts to salivate. It really boils down to it. It sounds like a complicated process, but the physiology behind it is very simple. It's just stimulus and response, giving the brain a mirror. This is what your brain's doing. And I think like it'd be really interesting to find other ways. I think that's really the future of medicine and biology is like finding ways to apply that to other concepts, like I guess you could even say with cells, stem cells, regenerative medicine, where you have almost like these intelligent molecules that are telling the body kind of what it needs to do based on feedback that they're receiving. That really is what the immune system does. It just gets, I think we're kind of in a place now where our bodies are having a hard time doing that because of all of the external things that are going on in the environment, whether it's, you could I guess chalk it up to like chemicals, or just constant stress. I think that a lot of those like innate adaptive sort of control mechanisms that we have are sort of down regulated, and we need some of these things to kind of tell the system what it needs to do. It's not about like us trying to fix anything. It's about us giving the body the right input so that it can fix itself.
Totally. I had this notion. So, our tagline, stress to strong. And as a MoveMed's focus is largely impulse regulation from a from a sensory standpoint. That is like, can we deterministically perceive what's going on without having to assert that these emotions or the connotative values carry any weight in this just objective observation of the body or mind or whatever. And to the same effect, we teach people how to ingratiate certain kind of like qualifiers of stability, which when people say stability, they're like, what the fuck does that mean?
It could mean anything, yeah.
Yeah, the allowance of motion in a state of focus. So like not having to be guarded or fixated, but allowing for there to be some variability without consequentially losing out on the bracing mechanism you started out with. Kind of how I'll loosely describe this. And whenever someone learns something new, or it poses like a degree of threat into their already standing self visual, the thing that happens is everything kind of starts to collapse, and they have to objectively re-visualize themselves. But because they haven't integrated that variability or that non-stable point, which most people, the option to move is usually a lack of stability, less so a garnership of stability, because the amount of guarding people usually have suggests that any adaptation is going to be a conscious endeavor. So when we get people to make adjustments, we're not trying to be like, all right, this is what you have to think about, this is what you have to do, this is what you have to feel. All to the same effect with neurofeedback, we get people to start to deliver to themselves that all of these suggestions are just that. They're neurological suggestions, and none of them are demands, none of them are fixations. It's just like you have focus, and it's being bombarded with all these different kinds of awarenesses. And so your ability to retain focus through the task is going to be, how big are these awarenesses relative to your main objective goal? And so when we say stress to strong, what we're trying to deliver to people, just like neurofeedback, is some kind of like confining mechanism wherein they can see themselves without having to like go back in time or go back into the map to see themselves. But they start to interact with that live action stimulus or that live action information that gives you, all right, this is where I am in space. I don't have to ask questions. I'm just going to trust the map.
Yeah, it's almost like a reflexive response.
Yeah.
And I really think that this is where people get self-organization and gamification of training wrong, because they think that gamification or some type of coaching practice or art that uses what could be loosely called self-organization is this process of just throwing people into chaotic environments and saying, hey, figure it out. And
Yep.
the problem with that is that people already don't have it figured out. It's like they're coming to see you because they're in their sport and they're fucked up and they're not able to do all of the things that you're claiming is the solution to their problem, right? So it's not, people think there's kind of these two camps where it's like you have people in like functional patterns or even Goda that are very like, the entire practice from beginning to end is very cerebral, and it's very step by, like you got to do all of these different things, and that is how you get to where you need to be, versus what you're talking about, which is really what I would consider the fundamentals of self-organization, is giving the body the right inputs, which
Right.
sometimes doesn't look like self-organization. Sometimes in the beginning phases, that almost looks like this sort of like remedial, very clinical, like corrective exercise, like very heady approach, but it's really not. It's like, I put it this way, and this is very, very simplified, but if you don't have like shoulder internal range of motion, you can't self-organize into the layback of a baseball throw, no matter how many good drills you give someone. Like, let's say they legitimately have scar tissue and calcification in that joint from an injury. It doesn't matter how much self-organization you do, they have a mechanical roadblock that's blocking their ability to do that thing. So now you use, maybe you hit it with some shockwave therapy, you take some supplements to get rid of the calcification, you take some proteolytic enzymes to get rid of the scar tissue. Maybe you actually take the joint and you move it through some ranges of motion, or you do some corrective exercises so that you can actually move the joint again. Like, this is very simplified. It's a very simple way of looking at it, but this is exactly what you're talking about in a more like dumbed down sort of way, where we need to go in and sort of like clear some of the debris first, so that we can get people into a place where where that person can get into a place where they're not being OCD about every little step in their movement or their plan.
I agree with you. Being neurotic is very prevalent in those camps. I mean,
oh yeah.
So if everyone's stressed to a standard that when they go into that framework and they're trying to learn the new behavior, it's like building a sandcastle while the tide is rushing over it. Like, there's just fundamentally not enough foundation for there to be stability. So they're blaming it on, oh, this is not creating stability. It's not creating stability. Well, the underlying focus or the underlying allowance for stability is, are you interacting with the stimulus, or are you refusing that momentum or that motion to travel through you? The word that comes to mind often is not flexibility or mobility, it's motility. And if you're talking about a joint, you're not talking about flexibility and mobility first. You're talking about motility. You're talking about how does inside that structure do things move around, not how does
Mhm.
the
The
superficial.
structure itself. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's like the micro movement before you have macro movement sort of principle.
Exactly. Like if you're speaking or if you're thinking to yourself and you're being audible in your brain, more than likely you are moving your vocal cords, and you're probably moving certain things in your mouth without even feeling it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So my question for you in that is, when you're looking at someone who's coming from any system, because I know that you're doing something similarly in the same consideration of, if someone's coming to you and they don't have the ability to process their inputs, then you try to approach it with, these are the right inputs for you specifically, or these are some things that might get you to perceiving those inputs, which is similar to our foundational, like 4 exercises, the deep pressure therapy, the kettle feet, just stimulus to allow for people to incorporate um, variability in the stabilizing effort, such that their feet, their knees, their chest, whatever, everything can start to motilize without having to take certain shapes. It can just start to move a little bit better against the things that it's creating friction against. So
Mhm.
when you deal with a FP guy, you deal with a GOTA guy, you deal with an injured person, and they're looking for the variability that they think they need, how do you communicate to them that stability is not so much a let's throw all these options at the thing? It's more giving the individual an option to resonate with that type of variability that maybe they kind of have a grasp on, but they really, really don't make the right behaviors around. And so we have to like take it really simple. We have to put the training wheels back on for a little bit until they can kind of normalize their foundation. How do you communicate that to people?
Yeah, I think I don't really have a set way of going about communicating certain things that I want. This is going to sound weird, but I don't think I really have a set way of going about communicating things like that in a very like, this is your problem, I'm going to explain it to you this way sort of thing.
Yeah.
I've and a lot of people that follow me have noticed that they don't even realize they're doing this until like 2 to 3 years down the line, where suddenly they're thinking about training in an entirely different way than like before they started following me, right? And I don't
Really?
really like give people any one explanation. I like to try to teach people how to think about training, right? And a lot of that is philosophy, a lot of that comes down to logic, and a lot of it's intuition, right? Because if we actually think about a lot of the pieces and the components that make up things like philosophy and intuition, or I'm sorry, philosophy and logic, they're all things that are very intuitive, right? As a kid, you did certain things and you had certain ideas about certain things that you did that you thought were right, and you grew up and maybe you like forgot about those things, right? You learned how the world works, you learned how the world is supposed to be, right? You're like given this sort of clinical outlook on things and how things are supposed to be, and you lose a lot of that like intuition that I think a lot of us all had. And then I
Yeah.
think if you're lucky enough, you find people like me or you find people like yourself and you start reading some of this content and you're like, oh shit, a lot of this philosophy and a lot of this like logical stuff makes sense to me. This was like stuff that I thought about when I was a kid. I used to think about, I used to think about certain concepts and certain ideas, and it's like a almost, when you're taking an IQ test, some of what an IQ test is measuring is a lot of these innate abilities, right? I don't think that IQ gives us the entirety, obviously, of human intelligence, but it is a subset of some of these things, right? Like if you're a kid taking an IQ test, it's not like how much knowledge you know, it's this innate understanding of like pattern recognition and things like that. And so I think it's getting people to trust a lot of their innate knee-jerk reactions to certain things. Like a really good example of this that I discovered, it's funny, like I'll talk about certain things that I think are true, and then I'll have somebody send me a DM and they're like, "Oh, you should look up like this word. It explains this thing that you've been talking about, and I'm like, well, shit, I didn't even know there was a word for that concept, right? Like I talk a lot about the balance between needing to be grounded in reality and to be honest with people about reality, but also to maintain this sort of hope that regardless of like the difficulties that you're going to face, you're going to prevail, right? It's sort of marrying like the Joe Dispenza and the esoteric with like the very practical side of personal development, and like, not spiritual bypassing, but taking accountability for yourself and reality, but also kind of looking at life as sort of this magical, mystical sort of thing where your thoughts also influence a lot of the outcomes that you achieve. And so it's like, how do you marry both of those things? And I talk a lot about the importance of that. And I think it was Jeff Wolf, the Flexible, on
Yeah.
Instagram. He sent me a DM. He's like, I found this word that explains what you've been talking about. It's called the Stockdale paradox. And I'm like, dude, I love this. But this is something that I've thought about since I was a kid, is like understanding this balance between, well, I need to try hard in school, right? And I know that I suck at math, but I also need to like maintain this positive attitude that, I'm gonna be able to like, um, learn it, right? It's kind of like marrying the practical with sort of like, I guess, some of these esoteric ideas. And I never had a word for that, but it was always something that intuitively I felt like I understood. So I think, kind of long way to answer your question, but I think going back to how do you teach people how to get out of that frame of mind, it's giving people examples. It's explaining things like this. It's really breaking down the philosophy and the logic of training, of nutrition, of some of these ideas, and marrying them together. And I think a lot of it is something that isn't going to happen with one explanation. You're not going to give somebody this single explanation where it's like, oh, okay, suddenly that makes sense, right? It's explaining things from a lot of different vantage points. It's giving people a lot of different logical skills that allow them to kind of recognize some of these things that they already do intuitively very well. And then it's just doing that repetitively over time, because I've had plenty of clients that I've trained and worked with over the years who, they come to me and they don't know anything about fitness. They're like a blank slate, right? And taking some of those people and teaching them how they need to look at training and how they need to ultimately get to the point where they don't need you anymore isn't a one-time process. It's not like there's this grand unified. That's the problem with these like grand unified theories of like movement and training and stuff, is like there is no one grand unified theory that I can plop down in front of you to explain all of this. A lot of it's subjective. A lot of it's subjective and objective, right? There's tangible components, but there's also intangible components to it. And the only way to learn how to navigate that is through experience, but it's also through accumulating knowledge and through me explaining why we train and how we train and the philosophy of the training and the details of the training. It's doing all of that over the course of like 3 to 4 years, right? So when people ask me like, what book should I read? What philosophy should I'm like, I don't know how to answer that, because there's so many different things that go into it, and there's so many different mental skills that I think people need to learn to develop, that it really does have to be this almost holistic process of like changing the way that you view and interpret information. um, I guess that would be probably the simplest way for me to put it, is like you really just have to change your entire personality in a sense.
It's like religion. It's like anything that
Yeah.
you're joining into and you're defining your reality off of.
Yeah, well, because I mean, let's say you try to take a GOTA guy or a functional patterns practitioner. There's no possible way that you can get some of these people out of the because every camp that people fall into, there is a there is an underlying set of like logical assumptions. Like, it's your worldview. The reason that you view and that you fall into the GOTA camp or the functional patterns camp is because of some type of underlying worldview that you have that predisposes you to view certain forms of information in a certain way. This is why materialism exists, right? This is why there's some people that do not believe that there's anything other than the physical world, right? And that empiricism is the only way to go about like determining facts about reality. They deny that philosophy is important. They deny that things like presuppositionalism is important. So you can't, these people are going to continue falling into these pathological ways of viewing training and viewing nutrition and even viewing their own relationships and even viewing the world around them if they don't change some of those underlying patterns and lenses that color how they view that information.
Dude, it's the distinction between narcissism and stability. So how people can expect there to be a viewable or objective scene and not have to organize certain expectations or perceptions around, like, if I can see this and I know other people can see this, this is the way it is. And having the continuity of other people be able to relate to what you're experiencing is going to be a huge deliverable. Someone's mic is still
Yeah, I think that's your mic, Grant. You're feedbacking a bit.
Oh, gotcha. I can't see from the reflection.
What's going on with it?
I hear myself and some noise in the back.
Okay. Give me 1 second. Is that good now?
It seems like it might be. I don't hear anything right now.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, I really like the way you explain that. I've never heard somebody explain some of these things the way that you explain them. Like you have an interesting way of like tying together some of this into like some of these common personality traits that we see that a lot of people have, like narcissism. And everybody thinks that everybody's a narcissist now, but I think that's like a different topic. But I think that a lot of this, yeah, it really does kind of come down to your personality, because there's some people that I look at and I'm like, I don't think I can ever change the way that you think about information, because it's either one, you would have to have something happen to you that shook you enough to your core, that made you self-aware enough to say, I need to change, right? I think that a lot of people, in order to even view, in order to view the world differently, so that's one part of it. So to view information differently and to view the way that you interpret information in sort of this almost like reflexive sense, you have to change the way that you have to change your worldview. And to change your worldview, most people have to go through some type of healing crisis, or just some type of crisis in their life where if they finally realize that they need to change some aspect of themselves and how they're viewing information, or how they're viewing the world itself. And until that happens to somebody, like I have a friend who, I mean, it doesn't matter how much content I put out on Instagram. It doesn't matter how much I talk about like these theoretical orientations around nutrition, or why it's important to eat a certain way, or why it's important to do certain things. This friend never changed. He never, it was like he had, earplugs in, and he couldn't listen to me until something happened to him, until he had ran out of options. He was going through his own healing crisis, and now he's like, okay, now I need to listen to this because I have to, right? Some people have to get to that point in their lives where they're forced to make a change. Then they can change their personality. Then they can change their worldview. And then that's going to change how they view information as well, I think. And so there's some people where I just have to admit, like, and if somebody's coming to me for help, I think they're already there. I think they're already far enough down that road for me to maybe be able to kind of change them with more of like an intellectual sort of, approach or communication style. But some people just, they have to have that worldview shattered aggressively by some type of circumstance before they're ever going to consider any of the things that we've even talked about here.
If we look at any of the systems that are run by someone who we see as like a governant personality in the fitness space or whatever niche space of the fitness realm that they're in, you'll always see that there's some distinguishing social factor that makes them kind of hard to relate to. And when I say narcissism, I'm really just saying that there's an expectancy that this person can only interact with themselves from a lens of expectation. Like they know how the world's going to unfold. And if it didn't unfold like that, they don't have the preparation or the time to consider. And so their impulse regulation or their impulsivity doesn't correlate with being motile or like being flexible in changes to their scenery. So that's why you always see that their energetics, like their emotions, are always being expressed from like a singular line. If we look at Weck, it's very frenetic. If we look at Naudi, it's very like compulsive and like ordered. And we're essentially seeing someone who doesn't have the range in their own personhood to be exposed to you in a way that's not controlling or confident or secure from their lens. And narcissism is not evil. We all are narcissistic at times, and we all have qualities that are narcissistic. It's just that if we define ourselves through those qualities, that those are our strongest or most reliable qualities, we end up being a non-human. And so there's like, you get stuck in qualities that are non-relatable because no one else is feeling your self-obsession. They're not feeling like you're stuck on that same behavior and that they have to deal with it every single part of the day. So they don't like relate to it. And
yeah.
it's
And I
antisocial.
think, yeah, and with narcissism, obviously, there's that inability to see or care about someone else's perspective. And so I think it's ironic that a lot of coaches in the fitness industry have that quality because, and again, look, I'm not saying necessarily that you can't have I have my biases and I have my things that I enjoy, and I attract an audience that also tends to enjoy those things.
Yeah.
And so it's self-selecting. But I think at the same time, when we're making these recommendations or these prescriptions for what other people need, right? Like other people that are maybe outside of our immediate niche. It's very easy to begin to like start imposing a lot of like what you said, these narcissist almost like, well, this is the way I view it. This is what's right for me, and therefore this is what everybody else needs as well, right? I really think that functional patterns and practices like that really is the outcroppings of narcissism in a sense, like you said, because it becomes this very it becomes your personality manifested out into the world, which is your system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then other people latch onto that and they start buying into this idea that they need what you think you need, right? Because what you think you need is typically why you create the systems that you do, right?
Exactly.
For me, and this is, I think, what kind of differentiates what I do now from maybe what I used to do, is that my only goal is to help people. Simply because what I needed at a certain period in time was things that worked for the average person. Like what I needed for myself wasn't this like highly specialized problem that I had, right? It was problems that lots of people had that I was trying to fix and figure out. And so it was a smooth transition between these are the things that work for me, but it also turns out that a lot of these things are also what other people need as well. And so I've had to become very unbiased in the way that I look at information and solutions. I always tell people like what I do, I have a hard time sometimes defining it because I don't have an approach.
Yeah.
My approach, I have a framework, right? I guess maybe some people could call that my approach. I have a framework that I like to look at things through, but my approach changes a lot based on who I'm working with. If I have somebody that has shoulder pain, I could give that person probiotics because it might be their gut. I could give that person an exercise because they might just need to strengthen their shoulder. I might need to give that person a breathing. There's so many different things that I'm looking at, whether it's like passive interventions or passive modalities or active interventions. I don't put things into this category of like, this is better than this, right? This is what a lot of people in like the evidence-based community does. passive interventions are worse than active interventions, or whole food is better than supplements. It's like, well, what context are you talking about
Yeah,
that in, right?
yeah. Everything's good when it has its moment, or when it has its when everything's ready for the thing. You could have a way better response from supplements than you could from the eating, especially if your gut's all kinds of fucked up.
100%.
Um, one of the cool things that I think we don't create a correlative to is like how definitively recoverable the body is. Like you could do all kinds of things to your body, and it's not about doing the right kind of movement. It's just about having the natural mechanisms that exist within your body being free to do their shit. And if we get there to be reduced stress factors, almost everything kind of supports itself in some fashion or another. It's like they're all autonomically predisposed to knowing what they have to do. I think something that we do have to come to terms with is, because there are underlying functions in the body, right? There's underlying relationships. As you had said, it's difficult to communicate words because there's a processing lag, which is like the limbic system knows what it feels. The words know they have an associative meaning, so we know connotatively what we're trying to say. But the associative of like trying to take the perfect word to describe this imperfect feeling, or this like unsteadied kind of expression, it doesn't work. It doesn't always have the same deliverable. So it's where we resort into body language. It's where we resort into other things. But I think most people, when they don't have an answer, they minimize. So they'll reduce, they'll retract, and they'll start to consolidate around a much smaller objective image. And as a byproduct, their ability to relate to the three dimensions that may come about if someone's emotionally engaged this way, or physically engaged this way, or they're dumb and they don't know the scope of things that may be on the other side of the wall, there's probably going to be like an impulse regulation issue, just like frustration, just like a little kid having a tantrum, which is, I don't know how to socialize with the person on the other side of me, and I can't go through the 10 years that I needed to go through to figure out how they're going to understand what we're talking about here. And so there's oftentimes we're going to skip all that shit. I don't even trust that you're going to be able to fix that knowledge to your brain. And we're going to jump into my process and procedure, which is oftentimes WEC method named after him, functional patterns. It's not named after him, but you know who he is and you know what he is, just depending on the language that travels outside of it. Go to greatest of all time athletics. If you're not a narcissist, but you call yourself the greatest of all time, I don't know what you are, but you are something.
Yeah.
And that same thing goes to like one of a kind, like movement, like
Oh God.
vague. I didn't want to do any of that shit. And in the same effect, like not wanting to do it, trying to be special, the same effect can be seen as the same narcissism. But I don't want it to be me. I don't want it to be Ben. I don't want it to be Dave. I want it to be whomever the person that's coming to us needs, you know? Like we're all going to have our different qualities of efficacy, and I'm certainly not going to be the most socially like comfortable person to intake for a lot of people, but there is going to be a different deliverable for everyone, and it's all about how we can respectively socialize and kind of integrate. Hey, I know you're not super hungry for this right now, but I can see you kind of need this. I'd like for you to trust me that you take a couple of bites. We don't have to finish this, but we do have to commit to at least trying it. And as we get people to start to understand that it's not as much fear or whatever, but it's the minimization of threat, like how we can fundamentally, if we don't understand something, it becomes a little bit scarier, a little colder, a little hotter, or something that's just like, oh, it's a little sharp. I don't really want to cut myself right now. I'm a little tired. I want to go hang out with some friends. I want to be happy. So I'm going to stay away from that. And if people just know that you can always fall down and get back up without it ruining your day, you make a huge degree of progress. You know, it's just like everything changes when you understand you don't have to be perfect all the fucking time.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between, like a system that you've created where it's malleable and it's designed to be this flexible thing that supports you rather than this rigid set of rules that you're trying to dogmatically follow or apply to an individual, right? What's the word called? There's like two different, I guess, kind of like orientations where you have people that generalize things at a population level onto individuals So I guess that would be like an ecological fallacy. And then you have people that generalize qualities of the individual onto the population, right? And they're both, I think that a lot of these systems that you see pop up, like functional patterns and whatever, Goda especially, is that's really what's going on. It's a fallacy of either particularizing something that's really general or generalizing something that's very particular, right? And that's what I like about systems like yours. It's more of it's a system for everybody in the sense that we're not forcing something on people. We're getting people into ideally or hopefully a better place where they can regulate their own selves to go and do the things that they want to do, rather than to say you can't go do that because it doesn't fit into my model.
Totally. And my model being the precursor of that, like you go up to Weck and you suggest something that he doesn't do, you're more than likely not going to be approved on doing it. You go up to Nowdy and you're probably going to get a lecture on, did I say that? Did I whatever? And you're not going to get the green light to go ahead and do that. And then when you talk to, like, the distinction would be you're talking to someone who's very strict in their ideals, talking to someone who's kind of foo-foo in their ideals, like a breathwork environment, like any Wim Hof thing. And the amount of sensation you have to feel in order for it to be right is almost a polarity to the amount of like non-variability you have to feel for it to be right in one of the biomechanical models I just mentioned. So it's literally just as you said, you're looking at the person, the mirror of the person who designed it in a behavioral context. You're seeing how this person relates to wanting to get intense. You're seeing how this person relates to their focus and drive and like what helps them stay intense. So you're seeing all the faces, you're seeing all the one thing I like to see is like how much thinking you can see in their eyes and how little rotation you can see around their ears. Because I like to think the eyes, when they're forcing rotation, they take the shoulders out of the context. You take the depth of the shoulders out, you take the depth of the lungs out, and you've now become a little bit more two-dimensional just because your eyes don't have the same depth of field that like your shoulder joint might, or the roundness of your rib cage might. So if someone's fixated in being a certain way, you're seeing like their eye mannerisms or their breathing mannerisms. And then you start to adopt these things, even if you're doing the inside ankle, whatever, you're doing the TVA tensioning. What you're really doing is you're tensioning your fascial origin points, is what we call them. But it's essentially like the four primary locations that we started in embryo as like a developmental. So our cranial area develops, our thoracic area develops, our our gut with the solar plexus and intestines included, and then our pelvis develops. So they're essentially neural crest points of places that we develop all of our tissue, fascia, all that in womb or in utero. And when you start to see how someone organizes any one of those points, you'll start to understand that their behavior is oftentimes a checking off checklist. So like their eyes help them fixate their breath helps them fixate their balance, and then so on and so forth, as opposed to all of it being a recycling regulatory system. It depends on how the eyes feel. It depends on how the throat feels. And so they stay fixated, or their version of stable, which at the end of the day means their version of variability is much lessened and expectant. Like they know how much variability they can expect. They're not going to get too far into it, that kind of thing.
Well, their version of stability is almost closer to the traditional version of what people think of as stability, which is rigidity, versus your definition of stability, which is really more of this like conglomerate sort of quality that really is adaptability and the ability to orient a lot of these things in space like that you're talking about without compromising other components of the structure, right? So like, let's say you're talking about bracing. People might call that stable, but there's a lot of instances where that really could be considered unstable if you're running. Or you're
Yes.
running and you know, you've ever seen a picture of the owl where they're moving the owl and its head is kind of like on this swivel thing, and that's stability. You know, like if you're
Yeah, yeah.
sprinting and you can turn and you can catch a ball, but you can also catch a ball, right, and land at the same time.
Yes.
I was learning when I did that RPR, that reflexive performance reset course years
Yes.
ago. One of the things that I theorized based on some of the information that they told us is that a lot of people that have what could be considered a jaw compensation, so they drive a lot of stability through like clenching down with the jaw, will have a difficult time. Like, let's say they go to or actually, here's a better example. Let's say they draw a lot of stability through like hand clenching, right? There's sort of this, you know, like the homunculus diagram where you have the jaw and the hands. Like a lot of these things obviously aren't close to each other in the body in a sort of physical sense, but in terms of like this like neural sort of like tissue or this neural crest, like a lot of these things are kind of situated in a lot of like control areas of the brain that are right
Totally.
by each other, right?
Yeah,
And so
totally.
you could almost think of someone going to catch a football, they're jumping to catch a football, and they create a lot of neurological stability or tension through their hands. And now
Yes.
this person's jumping up, they're catching this football with their hands open now.
Yes.
So they no longer have this like this clinching ability to create stability through their hands. They're jumping up to catch this football, but then they land on one leg and they blow their ACL out because
Right.
all of the normal mechanisms that they would use to tighten up the knee or to tighten up these other structures where they clinch down really hard and they create a lot of this irritation or stability through the body is now gone because they have their hands open, right? And so that's
Totally.
really what I think of as stability is being able to disassociate and also associate at the right times, because a lot of people look at association, like you could think of training in the sense of association as approximating like a lot of behaviors or contractions together, right? If I
Yeah.
squeeze my hands and I squeeze my core together and I make my entire body really tense and tight, a lot of people think this is more functional. And there are instances where you need to do this. If you're picking up a couch or something, where you're lifting a heavy weight, but people think that that's stability, and they think that being able to disassociate or isolate certain components of the body, whether it's isolation from like a neurological perspective, where you can control one part of your body while another relaxes very easily. Or maybe we're talking about, you know, just even like traditional isolation exercises. I think this is where people get things kind of mixed up because they look at disassociative training as not functional because you're not approximating a lot of different things together. But
Totally.
that's really not what performance is about, right? It's about being
The
able to
brain.
do what you need to do in the context that you need to do it in. And that, in my opinion, is really what stability is.
Totally. The brain has options. It's never, I mean, the idea that you have to be a certain way suggests that the brain also has the ability to predict the future. It does not. So moving off that matter of fact point, we can't move off of contingency that says, in this situation, in this situation, in this situation, there's no such thing. We have no idea. And if we have to walk around with this predisposition, we're going to make life way harder because we have to make a million more decisions. And that's the benefit
100%.
in autonomics. If you make less decisions, or if you're not obligated to make as many decisions throughout your day, which does not mean sitting down, you're not interacting with the world. It means literally having your life designed such that if you're going to do something new, old, whatever, you have a routine. You have something that you can like extrapolate the behaviors around.
Yeah, and I think this is very obvious in the sense like you get in a car and you drive, and there's a lot of things that you're not thinking about
Totally. Yeah.
that are very almost reflexive, right? But then there's
And you
also
can't.
structure layered on top of that. The car only moves in a certain way. The car
Yeah.
can only do these certain things. So with the body, obviously, you can have this rule that says like these are the things that we can do within the defined sort of morphological limitations of our body. Like we can't fly. No matter how much you think you can't jump off a building and fly, right? I don't
Right.
care how adapted your nervous system is or how flexible or how much stability, you can't fly, right? But within these these limitations, and that's what I think some people understand, is they don't get this dichotomy between a constrained, limited system, but also having a lot of flexibility within that system too. And they misapply those concepts in a macro and a micro perspective, where they apply the rigidity in areas where it shouldn't, the system shouldn't be rigid, and they apply flexibility in areas where that flexibility really doesn't have a function or a purpose. It's
Totally.
not the system is constraining it in a way where that's not really bringing out a meaningful impact on people's lives or the way that they perform or live.
Agreed. I actually want to ask you something, Ben, to the effect. Do you mind if I ask you a question about your pop?
Yeah, go for
About
it.
who?
Cool. I'm going to ask Ben a question about his dad.
Okay.
So Ben was telling me his dad underwent a head injury, and he experienced some like cognitive and behavioral changes when Ben was young. And I've noticed that he has a much better tooling for behaviors or like human interaction, social interaction that he doesn't expect, being that I'm kind of hard to expect. He's been tremendously patient with me. But to the same effect, he also was like working with FP. He was working with a bunch of these other systems that traditionally are not like the most agreeable human beings you've ever met. And Ben has a really good way of like working his way through information without being a douchebag about it. And I'm not always the best at not being a douchebag, so I admire it.
Same. It's very respectable.
Yeah. So to the same effect, I'm curious, what do you think is necessary? Because this is not so much a training question; it's more just a human question. What do you think is necessary to convince someone who's not ready to be convinced, or to learn something they're not ready to learn? What do you think you have to do to provide someone value if they're not ready for it? Do you give them lesser value? Do you accept that that value is probably limited to what they're looking for?
Yeah, my thoughts, it's tough because I was always looking for different from a pretty early age. Like early age on, I was ready to move out, or I was ready to kind of change my circumstances. And I think that put me in an interesting position. And I just like seen a lot of shit where like I knew what the potential for human behavior could be, to like the extremes of like negative and just impulsive kind of action, where I would see like somebody like a naughty or whatever, and see certain elements of that, but like not see also the extreme. I also saw a degree of like, control, still something that I respected, and like he's able to organize himself in a way that I can understand is like better than some of the other things that I've seen in my life.
Yeah. It's like lesser of two evils, kind of.
Exactly. And to be able to see kind of like the shades of gray between those, and where the value in those shades of gray are. If somebody's not, if I mean, everybody's seen some shit for sure. But I don't know how much they see at the same time the potential for it to be different.
For sure.
And that's, if somebody's not in that point, like you said, Grant, like it's almost impossible until they go through the point where there's no other choice, but like I have to figure something out because something's gone terribly wrong in my life, and now I'm like, okay, now I'm willing to change. I would say in terms of like how I maybe interact well with various degrees of information and the people who are serving them up, regardless of the method or whatever. There's something I read. I think it's like a Taoist thing. It's like the law of the impersonal, and it's kind of like a lifestyle thing where regardless of what's happening around me, like it doesn't reflect anything about me, or I don't have to like take somebody else's story about myself or like the human condition or whatever and necessarily like mean that it demands that I have to change or be a certain way. There's almost like a certain level of like healthy apathy that
Oh yeah.
I feel like it makes it easier to maybe kind of roll with the punches, so to speak, to have essentially that adaptable stability in the midst of like just kind of weird social interactions, or like socially like stranger people or not, that allows you to kind of like pause, step back, and be like, okay, well, how do I want to react in comparison to this, or how do I want to react based off of what I'm seeing, to like not escalate the situation, but also to make sure that like we're all getting the most out of this interaction, or I'm getting the most out of this learning environment.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what came to mind. And to teach that to somebody, to get somebody to that point, I'm still very much figuring that out. But I do think it is essentially being the mirror, being an example of like um, an adaptable nervous system that can act different people in different ways.
Yeah, I think, yeah, what you said there was great, because I think there's two kind of ways that you can approach it. That was one that I was going to bring up, is that, you can relate your experience to someone else. You can confer some of the emotion. If you're good at this, you can confer some of that emotion, especially if you're like, like, this is what movies are, right? When somebody makes a movie, they're conferring something they've created, and they're trying to get you to feel, the same way, even though maybe you didn't have that experience, right? So I think that you can confer some of that on an emotional level without that person having to experience whatever you did, or to go through the same crisis, by kind of conferring some of your emotion onto them, in terms of like, maybe your story was really inspiring, or maybe there's some type of like emotional or like perspective that you have that maybe would resonate specifically with that person, and that kind of pulls them into your world a little bit, right? And I also think breadcrumbing, I always call this like breadcrumbing, where with a lot of my clients, sometimes it is about meeting them where they're at and giving them very small doses of things that are enough for them to handle, right? If I always give this example, if I have a client and the one thing that they can do is take magnesium, and they take that magnesium and they sleep 10 times better, now it's like magnesium is like a gateway drug for them. And now they're like, okay, I am sleeping really good. Maybe what else could I take that would get rid of my anxiety? And a lot of people have this backwards approach where they try to get people to do all the big picture stuff before they do the small picture stuff. But the big picture stuff is a conglomerate of a lot of small picture behaviors, right? And it's really hard for people to get this big picture stuff down, like diet and exercise, until you've given them little pieces that allow them to kind of almost feel sort of a slight inkling of what it would be to feel like if they went all in, right? And so let's say this person starts taking a little magnesium, and all of a sudden now they sleep tremendously better, right? And now they're taking other supplements. They're taking some zinc, they're taking some B vitamins. Then maybe that leads them into changing their diet, right? And the diet leads them into to getting more granular with their exercise, right? I think it's kind of a domino effect. And this is what I've noticed with a lot of my clients. I've trained people who could have given an absolute shit about any of the details of training or nutrition or any of this, until they started working with me. They just wanted the results, right? They wanted somebody to tell them what to do. And now they're at the point 3 to 4 years later where they've learned to own and internalize that process for themselves, where it's no longer about just going to see somebody to give them the answer. They're taking ownership of that process for themselves.
Yeah, it really is just like the potential for change. Like people out there that think the way they feel right now, maybe it'll change, but it's only going to go downhill. Like I've been with people like they see that potential for improvement, or they feel improvement, and they're like, I had no idea this was possible. And you're like, you just like gained 10 pounds on your bicep curl or whatever. You just like, it's just like the simplest thing where it's like, that's not even remotely a big deal, but I'm happy that you kind of are seeing light, so to speak, of that. And that, that's really what you said there. The breadcrumbs of that is the only way to take somebody from that state of just complete like lack of ownership over their own potential future reality, and giving them the car keys for it.
Yeah, and it really is them coming to those conclusions by themselves. It's just you giving them little pieces to kind of push them further in that direction every time. And that's what I really think coaching is. It's not trying to impart this instant understanding of the process. It's giving people the right pieces, like just like self-organization in a sense, where again, people think of self-organization as this big picture, like boom, you just throw it at everybody at once. But no, even with learning is a self-organizing process where the learner themselves is is being guided by the instructor through all of these little micro transactions, right? It's not this one giant philosophy, this one giant solution, this one giant conversation. People think that like with clients that you're just going to have, and some clients are ready for this, but some aren't. Some people think that it's going to be this one conversation where you sit down with a client before they start their training session or they start working with you, and you're going to explain everything to them, and you're going to lay all the rules out and you're going to lay all the theories out and everything, and they're just going to get it all of a sudden, right? And that's just not the way things work.
I think there's a huge corollary between the working man's idea of what stability is and how it's justified through the behaviors and basically the show put on by the trainers that many people are following. Like we may not understand the behavior, but in order for us to get to that same behavior, we would understand the rationale if we resonate with skipping out on seeing all the inputs in their full clarity. And we have to like minds. We're going to be relating to another person that probably sees less of the image or picture than we do, or than the average person does, or at least reforms their image or mental image to see the parts of the image that we like to see predominantly. And so you're watching people who are justifying your behavior through maybe a different parable of activities, but to the same effect, they're learning to qualify their value based off their reception from the audience, because they're not intaking the same sensory inputs that they're expecting you to, or they're talking about. If they were, the behaviors would change. But predominantly, if I'm going to look at, give you an example, Mark Bell, he's the guy with that tricep device for benching. Yeah, I see him running a lot, and he runs around. He's doing like the head over a foot, or he's doing the WEC stuff, or he's doing something, right? Or Goda. And when I see him doing it, I'm seeing a guy that's dense as fuck, like brick laid muscle. But just the same as bricks don't have a bunch of aerodynamics, he looks like he's running through a wall that's having trouble parting. And when someone's doing the things that they think or they recognize as being better inputs, or at least attending to the inputs and then qualifying, oh, because I'm paying attention to sensation, but I'm guiding the sensation, these are the right sensations. It's the same effect. If you have someone that's looking through the lens of, they're driving their sports car and they're like taking for granted what the sports car can do, but they're not a good driver. They're not like arbitrarily, if they were to go into a slower car, all of the skill that they qualified having disappears, because it was mostly reliance on what can I do in the immediacy. This car can do it for me. I don't even have to worry about any contingencies or like extra issues. And for someone who's fit and doing their thing, they're qualifying to an audience who's not fit and not doing their thing. Oh, look at how much value I'm getting. Well, that's relative to your experience. There's these people who need to figure out how to climb up a set of stairs and not get winded, or there are people who can't pick a child and they don't have any relationship with being that strong parent, so they don't even have any qualification of seeing themselves in a strong light. You don't have to storyboard celebrity, and that's a lot of what these trainers and coaches are doing, which is like, look at me, I'm doing it, you guys can do it too if you just follow along doing what I'm doing. The truth of it is we're all trying to figure out how to wake up in the morning, feel satisfied with what we're doing, and then go to bed at night feeling like we can sleep without having to look at the next day as if it's a task or burden of decisions, the same way today was. And the way I see a lot of these training modalities is they don't let you disappear. Like you can't depreciate the amount of weight of activities or decisions, because there's always a new decision getting you closer to that specific input registry, because you're ignoring a plethora of inputs through that effort. So my have all be all with that Mark reference is, when people are very intended to do good, which he clearly is, he looks like he's a fucking awesome dude to hang out with. but he also looks like someone who's clearly in a tremendous amount of pain, and he has a degree of like, I'm going to do it at my pace, and I'm going to take away the treats as they come, and I'm going to feel really good about them. But in truth, there's still a lot of issue, and I'm only like piecemealing my benefits. Not anyone, unless they're a career athlete or a career lifter or whatever, is going to relate to that. So someone jumping into the gym is not going to relate to that. They can for sure pursue the same behaviors and like find the same sensory inputs, but it's not going to be to the same effect. Like they may have more potential, less potential, whatever. So my point is, I think any coach needs to reference that life is a complex network of I don't know, but I'd like to find out. And when we start to do that more humbly, instead of feeling like you watching me find out will be better than you watching someone else find out, we'll start to take into the fact that you're not watching everyone find out by watching this one person. You're watching just this one person. And until that one person takes into account, I'm not special. I'm just, from my lens, I understand it. So I'm doing it from this lens. There will never be an integrity about learning. It's always like, my learning, my learning, my learning, my learning. Or it could just be, are you perceiving the sensory environment at its natural presentation? Or are you fabricating things to make it seem a way that it's more comfortable or more appealing, or you're ignoring things? Reality is truth. It's not avoidance. It's none of that shit.
Well, and I think what this often takes the external expression of is someone who is kind of this loose collector of other people's ideas. And that really is what Mark Bell is. When you look at what he does,
Yeah.
he is collecting a variety of ideas, likely never truly embodying any of them, because you can't really embody a fragmented practice to begin with. Or never integrating all of it into a cohesive system. And this is this is the post that I made. I made a post today. I'll pull it up right now because I don't remember. I basically said, this is the gist of what I'm getting at. I said, you can take all the steroids you want and you're never going to be as strong as average dudes that look like me or half of the average people I train, right? And the idea behind that is that people are in their training, they're focusing on the wrong things. They're focusing on following people that have all the right exercises. They're focused on even effort. I think effort can be a distraction. I think people focus too much even on consistency. People focus too much on having the right periodization scheme. Nobody is ever focusing on like the pragmatic aspects of training, which is like, did I get a result? If I did this thing that's supposed to help me get out of pain, did it get me out of pain? And when you're not looking at training that way, your training, again, it becomes this loose collection of other people's ideas, and it just sort of becomes this clusterfuck where you see a lot of people that like used to be big weightlifters and then they get into like functional training and they like lose all their muscle, right? And then all of a sudden now they're like shitting on lifting weights. And this is that unfortunate part where this is like the pathological sort of manifestation of having a lot of experience. This person had the experience of being jacked and strong, and now they have the experience of being kind of like weak and fragile, but like thinking that's okay because they're more functional now, right? And they can never bridge these perspectives of seeing what was good in where they were and what might have been missing and how that led them to here, right? Because a lot of people that come from these functional training camps that maybe used to be a big weightlifter, or maybe they just focused on like just the squat, bench, and the deadlift for a while, they come from these very polarized backgrounds where that's all they did was like single effort strength training or single effort explosive work. And all of a sudden now they get into like things like trying to learn rhythm and coordination. And now they think that's like the panacea or the end all be all of training, because they never had a balanced perspective to begin with. It was just this pendulum swinging from one side to the other, where it was just closed environment training, and now they're doing coordination exercises or functional exercises or whatever it is. But the ironic part about that is that they're still missing this human element to it, which is, okay, cool, you want to do coordination, you want to do athletic stuff, How about you actually go play a sport? How about you actually go interact with another human being? Go do jujitsu, go play basketball. Dude, if you want to learn coordination and you want to learn rhythm, go play basketball and stop like dancing and like doing these coordination drills and these coordination exercises by yourself. Go do it with a real person. Learning how to read another person's behavior and to watch another person play a sport is immensely more valuable than just kind of like doing this like pseudo athletic training where you're like rotating around with like a cable stack and you're calling that functional or athletic, right? This is like this is still, you're still in a closed environment. So the irony of people taking these things that they think are bad, like weightlifting and strength training, in these closed environments, right? Oh, that's not athleticism because it's just single effort maximal strength training. And it's like, well, what you're doing isn't athleticism either. It's still isolated. It's still taken out of the normal environment that you would be in if you were truly expressing athleticism in relation to another human being, or running from a bear, or actually having some type of outside stimulus that you had to respond to. So it's really funny how these people will swing from one pendulum to the other, but they still miss the essence of what actually underlies a lot of the things that they're trying to get after.
Agreed. I'm going to interrupt just for 1 second because I have to take a bird out of the house. So I'm going to show you guys.
Oh, no worries, dude.
Uh,
I had a bird one time get in my house, dude, and just like shit all over the place.
What Maya's doing?
No, it just ran into the wall.
Damn, it didn't even try to. Oh, there it goes.
All right, buddy. I got you.
Can you imagine like having the ability to fly just in an open space, and then all of a sudden you're in a house and
Oh yeah,
he just flew into the other wall, bro. He's just flying into windows at this point. Oh my god, I feel so bad for him, dude. Just like being exhausted from flying into windows. Hey, buddy.
that's like what most people in our industry do. They just fly into different windows all the time.
He looks
They're
hurt.
just constantly trapped in this box.
Look at this, dude. Hey, buddy. You okay? It's all fucked up, man. He just flew into 3 windows.
Oh.
That's so fucked up. Oh, let's see, where do we put this guy? Put him into some bushes over here. You go, pal. You have a good day. Do your thing.
Is he good?
I don't know. I don't think he's good, but honestly, I don't really know how to attend to a
Put him under a red light panel or something.
Yeah, it's like a bird that got into a car accident. I don't really know how to handle
Yeah.
trauma to a bird.
Like, sorry, I can fix humans, but I can't fix you.
Yeah, I'm like trying to work on its feet. Well, that was cool. I know that was a little off topic. So
No, that was great.
If we could finish off, or at least touch on this topic before we finish off. So movement is a hard thing for a lot of people to put their heads around, and we actually are pretty close to a turn of exposure to people. Like, we're going to change the way that our content delivers, or at least organizes, so it'll be a lot clearer. But that's going to been like a couple years in the making. My clarity that I'd like to have people understand is like, stress is not a mental concept, although we can conceptualize it because it is a word. Stress is that conglomerate of all those behaviors that would be in our awareness if we weren't so focused. Like, we'd be able to attend to certain behaviors or actions if we weren't so linear in our progress. And so just by opening up our ears, so to speak, or like opening up the ability for our nervous system to listen, we take away a lot of stress factors, which is how the ears connect to the vagus, and how the vagus connects to the heart, and how the heart connects, or rather the vagus continues on down the abdominal cavity. We essentially say that stress is an objective instability factor to your core, and the core is like that centric tube or midline that goes from neck down to pelvic floor. And when anyone is like, we have to do this for our physiology, or we have to do this for our physiology, just as you were saying, like supplements for your shoulder to get your gut to, or for your shoulder to depreciate. Majority of the things that we have as a consequence of non-mobility is like the amount of stress factors that create themselves in our gut, because there's so much free air and there's so much toxic buildup, because it's all the waste factors in our body essentially just like stewing. And so majority of people in my mind's eye has like 10 to 15 pounds of excess weight from waste in their gut, and they have inflammation built out because those non-motile points in their gut can't really move the way they're supposed to. So they have to inflame or create a roundness to their abdominal walls such that they can rotate where maybe their shoulders are impinging it, or maybe their rib cage is impinging it. And that's why you see a lot of people with a dad bod, but that doesn't correlate with how much motility they have in their shoulders or whatever. So the have all be all of stress for us is literally just that your spine and the tissue cylindrically built out from there is oftentimes no longer a cylinder, because we've reduced planes of motion and we become more externally decisive. So that homunculus, the hands, the feet, the face, all those things that may be big in our brain, become more conscious, and they prioritize over our centric power supply, so to speak. So when you hear stress, I'm curious as to your own definition of seeing how they kind of relate. I'm sure they will. What is your presentation of what do you see when you see someone stressed, and how do they commercialize understanding it, or like what do they go to understand it?
That's an interesting question. How do they go about understanding what stress is, like when they're feeling it come up in their body in a way?
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people don't know how to differentiate between stress and some of these visceral processes that they have going on. So yeah, you could say, well, my heart rate has gone up a lot, and because my heart rate is up, but let's say I don't exercise.
Yeah.
And I made a post about this recently, actually. Part of the reason why exercise is important is it allows you to work through these high intensity, high cortisol responses. So like
Totally.
your heart rate is super elevated, or you feel a certain way, right? If you're watching a scary movie or something and your heart rate gets elevated, but you never exercise, you might take that as panic. If you don't have this like underlying ability, I think, to recognize what's actually going on in your body. And in order to do that, it's not so much about just like sitting around and like closing your eyes and meditating, right? I'm not saying that that can't be useful in some circumstances. I think there's definitely benefits to like an internal versus sort of an external orientation when it comes to exercise or mental work or whatever it is. But that's two sides of the coin. Most people don't have this. They haven't fleshed out their, like, I think, ability to handle stress through exercise and through things like that in a way that allows them to have enough like bandwidth to be able to differentiate when they're actually stressed and when maybe their heart rate is high and it's just high because they're watching a scary movie, or they had something happen that something fell off the shelf and like landed on the ground, and all of a sudden now your heart rate's really elevated, but then 3 hours later, because you don't know how to come down from that stress response, you don't even know that like that one little trigger that set you off 2 hours ago is now the reason that you're feeling anxious, but it's really just a response to some other thing that happened in your environment that maybe you sort of have like a maladaptive response to, simply because you've never developed your ability to tolerate stress, right? AKA just like stress tolerance. And that can be done, I think, in a lot of different ways. Exercise is obviously one of those in the broadest sense. There's details that obviously go into that I think are important, which really is MoveMed at the end of the day. That's the details of that process. But yeah, I think there's a lot, effective realism. That's the name for, our brain trying to, it's trying to interpret what's going on in our body, and it's trying to match it to things that are going on in the environment, right? This is why some people, I think, get really, that somebody might say something to them that they interpret as being aggressive, even if it wasn't, right? And so there's this mismatch between the way that somebody's making you feel and the feelings that are coming up in your body, and not really knowing how to differentiate between what's coming up in you and the reality of the situation that's actually happening in the external world around you.
Yeah,
I get that feedback.
I want to touch on one kind of aspect of that, which is the moment of overriding the feeling even during a set of like, oh, I don't think I can go anymore. Like I need to stop. I'm gassed, or if I drop down for this rep, I might not come back up. And you mentioned in that post you're talking about, like you essentially train the ability to consciously override that. Is there, like, you could call that just like digging in, right? You could call that a lot of different things, but is there any strategy to that, or is that just purely a recognizing, like acknowledging that moment of my body wants me to stop, and being like, nope, and, and just keep going, or is there anything else to it?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that I wouldn't even say that some people would say, oh, that's just like mental toughness, right? But it's not even just tolerating those sensations for the sake of tolerating them. It's the fact that you need to go there to develop the capacity to know what the other end of the spectrum looks like. That's really what it is. And it's not even so much of a process of like you actually have to do anything, I think. I think it's more of a like you need to actually have some experience going there. Otherwise, you don't know what the opposite end of that spectrum looks like simply by default. I really think that's more of what it is, because I mean, you could say the same thing about, like, people talk about like having an upright posture, right? The reason that we train forward flexion, or we train our ability to go into these extreme ranges of motion, isn't because we think those ranges of motion are the best options for, like, if I'm going to go pick up a couch, I'm probably not going to Jefferson curl it, right? But it's to give the body the neurological and the structural awareness of, if I can take my structure and my frame and my body, my nervous system here, maybe this is really where I need to spend most of my time. But now this becomes less fuzzy. I understand what this is, and I know how to manage this better, because I can understand that maybe I need to be here, but I've gone here and I've gone here. So I have a better understanding of where the middle actually is, if that sort of makes sense. So I really think it's more of just an exposure thing rather than an I need to do something special in that moment thing. At least that's where I'm coming from it. But I think, Nate, and just all of the stuff that you guys do with Move Man, I'm sure there's probably some specific details that you guys do in your training where maybe there is a component to that where you flesh out the details of, like, with the sandbag breathing, maybe you are going and you're setting a specific time where you're going until you can tolerate it, and you're no longer getting a fight or flight response to this like 300-pound sandbag like crushing your thorax, basically.
Yeah, well, the way I like to look at it is tempering. I mean, Donnie Thompson has his body tempering stuff, which to an extent is very similar to what we do. But I think there is a causal difference, which is midline, or that centric structure that everything is housed around, is that primary deliverable where we want to feel the inputs, where we want to feel the sensation. Because if we can micro brace around the bone, then the muscle is probably freed up to move, and the bone is probably a little more stable, capable of taking more forces. So where I see a lot of things that are different in his process is usually like offloading stress. So it's not necessarily going there, it's staying in the experience until the muscle gives up, or till the muscle can adjust to the amount of stress. But it's not allocating that it's coming from centric core or midline, which it's an actual bloodstream system. It's like this. It's like what makes us similar to trees in our ability to bring blood back up to our heart and brain. That the skull is determined by our dorsal cavity, or like the fullness of the top of our skull is determined by how the blood comes back up our spine. And the ability for blood to come up our spine is contingent on how much tension we live in. So if we're living in tension as a byproduct of lifting all the time, then even if you go and temper yourself, you're not actually restoring a neutral, you're just mitigating the amount of deficit that your spine might experience in that reflow of blood and fluids. So what I like to emphasize is that we have an underlying like sponge-like quality that has us moving. It has us delivering an acquisition of up, down, around, rotation, and bracing, all these things. Like, how do we maintain our fluids? And if we can start to understand that our fluids are similar to how people say go with the flow, if we can improve our flow, we have an underlying niceness in our system. It's going to be like we have more energy and more alertness without necessarily having to be tremendously focused or fixated. And that ambience is like a smile that connects our facial nerves, the focus facial nerves, to our awareness facial nerves. So like how we can associate eyes to ears, listen while we're watching. It's like focus with awareness without having to be overwhelmingly alert. And I notice that most nervous systems are not capable of experiencing the thing without attributing meaning. And the worst version I've seen of this is the foo-foo stuff, like when you take Wim Hof principles and then you take all the physicality out of it, and then you're going around touching someone on their chest and being like, ooh, ah, and you're like, I want you to feel what you want to feel, and I want you to bring it to light in a special way. You're like, that's not tangible. That's literally psychosis. It's like manifesting an experience that has no visceral or connotative value, and you are telling your brain, I want to produce these reactions, I want to produce these responses, despite them having no social engagement factor aside from this one singular environment where people want to see it.
Yeah.
And we live in foo-foo. If you're the bodybuilder that's doing the body tempering, or if you're the go-to guy doing the ankle shit, or if you're FP doing the uptight stuff, everything is to facilitate or deliver a neurological environment that you expect and or want to facilitate in your life that makes easier everything. I can socialize in this group. I can breathe at my rate of comfort without being feeling like I'm not a mirror for my environment, meaning everyone else is equally stressed. So I'm not stressed. We're all stressed. So it's all good. And movement is literally, we're a social creature. Socialization, aside from eating, shitting, reproducing, and sleeping, that's our main one. Socialization is what ingratiates us to look each other in the eyes, look dogs in the eyes. It's what allows for us to, when we hug someone with our left arm over their shoulder and their left arm over our shoulder, our hearts can kind of sync up. There's making the vehicles connect is not a verbal thing. Making the vehicles connect is not an auditory or a sensory thing exclusively. It's that balance of when you can regulate yourself, and you can regulate yourself in front of someone, and you can see them regulating yourself. That's socialization. It's them being them, us being us, without there being we have to be the same person in the middle.
Yeah, and I think this is really important too, because a lot of people focus on the individual as the sole arbiter of this, like, being able to regulate yourself sort of thing. But we also use other people to regulate ourselves, right? We're never free from the influence of other people. I mean, and this is biology, right? Like heart syncing up and menstrual cycle this is actual biology.
Yeah.
And so we can't separate ourselves from other individuals. And I think too often we try to do a lot of these things by ourselves, right? A lot of this self-development, and a good majority of, like, even in relationships, there's this idea that you need to be perfect before you enter into a relationship. Yes, there's absolutely certain things that you need to do to work on yourself. I'm not saying that's not true, but there is a co-evolution of yourself with another human being that you also end up learning a ton about yourself through that experience, whether it's good or bad. And so I think a lot of this self-development and a lot of these, like you said, foo-foo practices are divorcing. I'm sure there's a community aspect to it, but it's pseudo community. It's not that component of that regulatory process has no foundation in relationships with other people, right? And I think that there's a really good book called um The Biology of Love, or how the book has like a picture of like two chairs on it. You might have seen it before. It's a popular book, but that's what the whole book is about, is like these limbic attractor patterns that we have to certain individuals, and how this can be very positive when we're attracted to the right kinds of people, and very negative, and it keeps us looping in these constant emotions and these constant ways of acting when we're attracted to people that are not good for us, right? And so there's the individual, I guess, component of orienting ourselves in the right direction with the right people. But then from there, again, it's almost like we've been saying, this self-organizing process of, okay, now we know what we need to look for in the people that we need to surround ourselves with. Now let's go surround ourselves with those people and learn how to regulate ourselves better, right? As opposed to like sort of the pathological version of that, which is either just focus on yourself or just go and throw yourself out into, the most horrendous, possible environments, or around the worst possible people.
Yeah, it's the avoidance of negativity through not exposing yourself to things you're bad at, which is so preposterously childish. Like you're telling me you're gonna teach these people how to feel good about themselves, but the reason why you're choosing these activities are because they're deliberately antithesis to the things you need to face right now. Like when I see men who come from, I've had a number of dudes come from my system. They get the certification. Maybe they're like somewhere in between, super committed to figuring out the answers and not really devoting the time that's required. And so I can kind of see the poo-poo unraveling before they even like finish with the stuff. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's mostly dudes. Is I think it's because they're trying to connect to that like softer side, that emotional side, and they think that's what sensation is. But these guys are probably more intense than the average dude, and they want to be accepted by the female like side of things, and they want to be like they want to be understood by the domesticated version of reality. So they teach their behaviors to be like very lovey-dovey, and they say the words that are like they mean a lot, but they don't mean anything. Like, there's a lot of connotative value, but you're hearing someone say a word, and you're like, what does that mean for your heart? Like, what is the change to your pace when you say that word? Well, I actually didn't really feel a change of pace. I'm pretty smooth here. That was just the thing that allowed for me to say what I wanted to say to you. They're never really speaking from emotion, is my point. They're speaking into emotion, trying to like produce responses, and all to the effect of you're making the instability that exists in your system justifiable because you're socializing with it. And that's like mental
Yeah.
illness. That's like what a lot of people do when they go into talk therapy is they stroke that feeling center and they never viscerally stabilize it. So there's no coordination of like, when I wake up tomorrow, I'm gonna be able to depend on me. It's the, all right, I got to think back to all the words we talked about today. I have to make 12 different decisions about my behavior. And at the end of the day, not really have a clear answer. I'm just going to watch it produce itself and see what happens. There's no
Yeah. And
visceral.
that's very similar to like what Jung would talk about, or what he would call like spiritual bypassing, I think,
Yeah.
in a lot of sense, where people take on these uh pseudo spiritual sort of like words or phrases or like ways of acting and being that aren't truly their authentic self, right? Like our authentic self is taking responsibility for these darker sides of our personality, like you said, with a lot of these men maybe that are like trying to put on this mask to comp to they know their problem. I think they know that they have a problem, but they're still not being fully honest about the problem, and they're masking it with platitudes and sort of this like fake sort of spiritual language and behaviors. And it's still very fragmented. Their personality is still very fragmented from who they actually are and who they claim they're trying to be. It's like these two separate divides versus like this is the persona I put on versus this is who I actually am, versus authentic spirituality or authentic personal development and growth, which is really sort of the marrying of both of those worlds where I'm becoming who I am and who I want to be as a result of like being brutally honest with myself and other people about where they're falling short and where I'm falling short as well, I think.
Oh,
Nate, your mic is off.
There's a plane overhead. When you read, it kind of communicates there's like a different perspective that you didn't plan for, in different words and different connotation. You're experiencing someone's limbic flow, or their cognizant limbic flow, like how they choose to express their limbic system. And if you don't have that ability to like read or appreciate the novelty of another person's expression, then I imagine most things are going to be rudimentarily expressed from your lens, which is to say, it's like kind of a childish perspective of thinking I'm right before knowing the answers. And I think if more people went into something, if they have no perspective of it, instead of like, I'm going to bull rush this, to continuously pick themselves up off the ground after deliberately falling over. Like, you're going to do shit. You're going to do a bad job at it. But the bad job is going to be made all the more worse if you don't own that was not the correct way to do it. And over time, as you start to condition yourself to understand, okay, I can keep going, meaning I'm not in trouble for doing it wrong, and then figure out how to manage the outcome as a byproduct of resourcing more and more motivation and clarity and whatever, then we start to understand what dopamine is. But the affect is we can drug ourselves and condition ourselves to feel like we are dope or experiencing like affirmative clarity when we're not actually. And a lot of that goes into, because most people are pretending to be calm, collected, and clear. They're smiling around, they're doing some shit that's like, I'm liking life, I'm really happy. And because people are seeing those things as opposed to the actual foundational factors of like, okay, I see stress in your neck, I see your eyes are really darty, I don't see very much moisture, I hear a lot of, but you're not swallowing a lot. Like you can hear like a reduced reflex. You can see that someone is struggling to manage just baseline behaviors. And when I see someone rerouting energy to conscious efforts, or rerouting energy to, hey, I want to make sure that you're looking at this and I'm experiencing what I'm actually looking at, I have no ability to relate to that person, because that person is unsafe, they're threatening, they're kind of like elusive around what they're experiencing. And to that effect, I can't trust their words because they're not speaking their experience. And we don't have to say like there's a right way to be, but we do have to acknowledge that there's a reason I enjoy talking to you more than I might enjoy talking to someone else who doesn't get it. And that's like, you can appreciate that it's tough to make your way, or tough to make it known who you are without having to like all the time prove your worth. But being in it to experience it, like suffering the consequences of saying something, you're like, fuck, I maybe shouldn't have said that, or fuck, what do I have to say to like make these people understand it? Am I even invested enough to like go through the effort? And then coming to terms with, I'm being antisocial right now, I'd like to be better than that. Let's figure out how I can be of help. Like as you were saying before, you want to help people, and there's still a lot of like personalization or privatization of our experience. Like we might take things personally, we might still get stuck in our shit. So how at the end of the day do we find ourselves being useful or valuable despite what we want to do? Well, we have to have a network or a facility wherein we can be, I'm not feeling great, I know this is a prerequisite or an expectation of my behavior. How do I engage with it without being a psychopath? And the only way to do that is to figure out how to be honest without having to be depressive, or having to be honest without being intensive and like making people drown in your experience. So the alternative would be hiding it, which is what I see 95% of people doing. And that feels like the worst kind of psychosis that breeds disease in the gut, disease in the heart, disease in the head. And the only reason why it absolutely does is because those things communicate with each other, and they're clearly not communicating with each other.
Yeah, well, this is the classic Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type scenario where if you actually really read into that story, you see that the expression of this monster is the result of this suppression of the monster, right? So the monster is going to come out significantly and be significantly more ugly when you repress it, rather than integrating those aspects of being authentic with people and integrating those aspects of your personality into a more authentic expression of yourself, right? So like you could look at a lot of people like I think the biggest issue with repressing a lot of these things too is that at some point they're going to come out, and when they come out, you're going to be really surprised by things that you see yourself doing that you knew about yourself but that you denied the entire time, right? I think the only person, there's a lot of frauds in the spiritual, like the pop culture, new age spiritual community, right? You can see it on these people's faces that they're really not the person that they claim to be. Like if you look into a lot of the Hay House publishing books that have published a lot of like, books on spirituality, a lot of people that have worked for that company have said, like, I know, I'm trying to think of some big like spiritual talking heads. It's very like pop culture spirituality. A lot of these people will say, I worked with this person on publishing their book and they were the shittiest human being I've ever met in my life. But then when you read their book, they're like claiming that they have the secret to like manifesting everything, right? And blah, blah, blah. I went to, and it's funny because this isn't something that I ever really thought that I would go to, because in my mind, I associated everything that I just said with this person. I went to a Joe Dispenza event, and I
Yeah.
associated a lot of those things probably with Joe Dispenza. Not because I had really looked into his work, but just because that was kind of my default
Yeah.
mode of like viewing that kind of content, I think. And when I went there, I was shocked at how authentic he was with
Hmm.
expressing his frustrations with the audience. Like there would be multiple times where he would stop the entire conference and be like, guys, wake the fuck up. He's like, I'm getting pissed off that you guys aren't listening to me. Most people would just try to hide that. But he was
Yeah.
very authentic in the way that he would show up and he would actually express his humor. Like I understand that probably a lot of what some of these people do, they have to tame their personalities. Like Huberman has to tame things that he says so that
Yeah.
he doesn't get canceled by the evidence-based community.
Real forcefully.
Joe Dispenza probably has to tame some things that he says so that he can get people into his world. But then, which I get, I think there is a certain, like Robert Greene talks about this a lot as well, where sometimes you do need to wear a mask in certain circumstances. But once people are in your world and you're in a setting or a situation where you have breadcrumbed people into your world, you got to take the mask off. You need to understand when the mask is functional. Because if we didn't have a mask, I mean, we'd be running around saying all kinds of shit that would probably get us locked up in jail or, killed,
Totally.
right? So it's not like this idea that the mask is not functional. The mask becomes pathological when we're wearing it all the time, right? And so I think that's another part of the awareness building process that we need to learn to be able to differentiate, like when we need to put and take off the mask, put on the mask and take off the mask versus, when this is like actually an impediment to our ability to communicate with other people, or even worse, which is really insidious, is when we're lying to ourselves and we don't
Yeah.
really realize who we actually are because we're constantly wearing the mask.
That's a tough one. You can't tell someone that they're not being themselves, because the first thing it's going to make them do is going to put them on threat, and then they're going to start acting different. You're like, they're going to correlate that you made them act different from themselves.
Yeah. So it doesn't work. You think it works, but it doesn't.
Yeah. It's a tough one. I think that it's much easier to do all this stuff, this movement shit, in person, because when I'm doing it in person, they don't have an action or an option to disagree with the sensation. I can see it happening.
Right.
And just in the registry, like I really do like the idea that you give someone a probiotic for their shoulder, like in that circumstance, because so much of what happens that people are holding on to is like when they say somatic sensory, it's oftentimes just like where in the part of the body you create stability in relation to the thing that didn't have stability. So it's like a jigsaw piece. If there's always an open piece, we're exchanging or moving that piece, and as we move it, other pieces open or like translate taking that load. And so people will fundamentally like focus on keeping that shoulder as that like open jigsaw piece or whatever, in consequence of all the things that are having to move or labor to make that open jigsaw piece. And if we were to be more cognizant that that piece has to move in order, that open piece has to move for us to like Rubik's cube our body in certain environments, that would be one of those instances where you take into account, maybe you have to offload a little bit of my frustration and make it clear where I am for people to stay with me in this. And that's something I try to do. Sometimes I may do it a little bit too forcefully, but I do think there is a huge value in being able to tell people, hey, we're socializing right now, and I don't feel like you're engaging with me. So are we going to stop or are we going to change it?
That's kind of a savage move too, because it's like, how many people interact with you like that? How many? I remember Elliot Holtz made a video a long time when he used to put out all those YouTube videos, and that was kind of like his approach for like dealing with challenging people. Is like you just sit them down and you just pull some real thoughtful type questions like that. I don't know, and they're just a lot of them just don't know how to respond. They're like, what? Like, like.
Yeah.
But yeah, hey, I'm gonna have to let you guys go because I gotta actually hop on a consult call here in like 10 minutes.
All good. All good.
But yeah, this was 2 hours of solid gold, dude. This was fucking great.
Yeah, it was awesome. I appreciate your time. Sorry if I was moving around a little bit. Someone showed up at the house and I started to.
Oh no, you're good, dude. Whenever I do my own podcast or whenever I'm doing consults with people, I love to get up and walk around too. I feel like I could think better. Whenever I was a kid and I was like doing my homework, I would always like put it on like a clipboard or something and walk around and do it. Because if I sat down, I could never focus on it. So even you can't see me now, but I'm always moving my fucking hands because I have extreme ADD where I like that's my version of like getting up and moving when I'm sitting in a chair is like I look around and I move a lot. So
yeah, the ADD of boys in class. It just grew up.
The fucking worst, dude. The fucking worst.
Well, I appreciate you, man. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. It was a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks, man. It was cool to be a fly on the wall for you guys is going off, and I look forward to cutting out some clips and stuff to get people with the lesser attention spans to still extract some of it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, this was great, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, we'll talk soon again.
Absolutely. See you guys.
Later, homie.